an IPC Joint Secretary, he insisted that I should come and the ticket would be reimbursed. So that statement of him had greatly impressed me. And then when I came here live in Mumbai, I found him the way he conducted himself with a lot of confidence and a lot of seriousness. Though I don't know much about his work, but that speaks volume and that had raised a lot of admiration for him. And like the previous speaker, Professor Bala Ganapati, he is also going to give out of the box thinking, a little in a way novel, new way, that is epistemic charity and the
question of recognition.
And the cognition of question of recognition. So he is also going to present to us a new way, a novel way of thinking. So my intuition about him, his confidence, and the way now he's going to present a new topic conform. So that conformed my intuition about him. So I hope you will enjoy his talk. Now over to Professor VIKRAM Singh.
Thank you, Professor Mao. A very good morning to all of you, my friends, colleagues, and students. Let me begin with thanking Professor Namita and her colleagues for organizing this conference, this seminar, and bringing us all together at Patagriba Shri Shri Shankar Dev College, Navgaon. It's a very new place for me. I thoroughly enjoyed all these days. I thank all those who have been involved in organizing this conference. Now let me very quickly come. I'm hoping I will have 30 minutes to talk. Professor Mao, I can talk for 30 minutes?
30 minutes, right?
Yeah?
Yeah, sure.
So the title is Epistemic Charity and the question of
30 minutes.
and question of recognition. What I'm trying to do is, in certain way, trying to address the question of credible knower, and that credible knower in this case would be a culture, a community, a communal knower. So when we talk about civilizations, cultures, we often talk about them as a quasi-ontological entity. They interact, encounter, sometimes clash. They dominate or recede. They persist, transform, or disappear. So in doing so, they acquire identities that both shape and are shaped by the identities of their parents. The claims, achievements, and the failures attributed to a culture or civilization receive varying degree of recognition. And such recognition, in turn, structures the normative space within which individuals and communities locate themselves. So what is it within a culture or civilization that seeks identity and at a time fears its crisis? What are the objects, values, practices, forms of knowledge that we recognize as constitutive of its achievements or failures? So this paper is an attempt to advance two interrelated claims. The first is the argument that the contemporary political and moral debates on recognition can be meaningfully resituated within the epistemological domain. The guiding assumption here is that question of identity and recognition, both at the individual and collective level, and I'm focusing more on the collective level, are fundamentally epistemic in nature. They concern not merely moral aspect or political inclusion, but also epistemic identity, which is to inquire who is recognized as a credible knower, what counts as knowledge, and which epistemic frameworks are granted legitimacy. Second, if the first assumption is acceptable, the second is the contention that theoretical investigation into the construction of knowledge play a decisive role in shaping the construction of identities and the conditions of their recognition. Epistemic practices, standards of justification, and interpretative frameworks importantly determine how cultures and communities come to be understood, evaluated, and acknowledged. Now, on this basis, the paper argues that concepts such as human dignity, respect, and equality are deeply intertwined with epistemic identity and epistemic recognition. While epistemic recognition may not exhaust the moral and political dimension of dignity, equality, etc., but the relationship between them is inseparable. This interdependence is particularly significant at the level of communities and cultures, where the mutual relevance of epistemic and normative recognition have not been improved. Now, debate on recognition have been framed within the moral and political philosophy from struggles for equal dignity to demands for cultural differences. Recognition is typically understood as a normative attitude, a matter of respect, justice, or political inclusion. Charles Taylor, I am briefly using him because he has that work, The Politics of Recognition. He proposes a thesis, I quote, "Our identity is partly shaped by the recognition of its absence." Our identity is partly shaped by recognition or its absence, often by the misrecognition of others. And a person or group of people can suffer real damage, real distortion, if the people or society around them mirror back to them a confining or demeaning or contemptible picture of themselves. Unquote. The worry is about non-recognition or misrecognition, which may inflict serious harm in form of oppression, what he calls imprisoning someone in a false, distorted, and reduced mode of being. He supports the thesis by citing the case of women in patriarchal society, blacks in white society, in the case of indigenous colonized people. They are induced to adopt a depreciatory image of themselves. In fact, in some cases, such picture gets internalized by the concerned people themselves. Rejecting high-minded moral absolutism, Taylor proposes a moral ground by invoking a moral sense where due recognition is not just a courtesy we owe to people, but a vital human need. It includes permissibility for each of us to be human in our own way, but in imitation of anyone else's life, not in imitation of anyone else's life. That is what can strictly be called being true to myself, leading an authentic life. These are his expressions. He writes, such originality can be articulated and discovered only by oneself. I propose here to take a step back and resituate the concerns of recognition, authenticity, and originality from moral discourse to more fundamental epistemic discourse. Insight is drawn from the literature on social construction and other literature on social epistemology. I won't have time to go too much of detail, and I have not also developed too much on this. This is the working paper. But so it will be more of painting a little more with a broad brush. It's a claim that knowledge is not autonomous, particularly the claim of modern scientific knowledge, we can always say. It is not based upon universal principles of rationality, but rather tied directly to social interests and conditions. Here I am referring to the works like Social Construction of Reality of Berger and Luckman, The Construction of Social Reality, or one can quote many other works of the sociology of knowledge. So there is a lot of meaning in arguing for leniency, charity towards others' way of knowing, or equality of all ways of knowing. Celebration of differences of non-Western, non-Muslim, non-modern, non-capitalist cultures around the world is essential for recognition of individuals and societies. Such recognition can be guaranteed only if there is a recognition of alternative epistemic frameworks and claims about comprehending the world. It would enable modern science to recover more humane, peaceable, and ecological manner. Presumably exemplified by the natives, tribals, women, non-Western, non-modern culture. This has been some of the the view in question is the ideal of universal standards of scientific rationality, like objectivity and truth. And its popular critique is broadly a denial of imperialistic, Eurocentric epistemological scheme as a whole and creating growth grounds and recognizing different way of it has very political consequences. It confirms well to the prevalent debates on the politics of recognition. So let me briefly mention the way we can resituate what I was suggesting, the moral and political concerns into the epistemic. Now there have been some works which already talk about a similar notion. My concern is like it is not exactly the way I am talking about it here. So the notion of charity has been discussed in some contemporary literature, like by Quine. In 1969, he describes a principle of charity, a phrase which was originally coined by Neil Wilson. Now, according to this principle, I quote, people should avoid attributing irrationality to others' statements, and thus people should not interpret the utterances of others as contradictory or absurd unless there is evidence to assume otherwise. So emphasis is on evidence to assume otherwise. Now, for example, to make it simpler, in Mahabharata, if we say, Yudhishthira declares that Ashwatthama had died, right? So Ashwatthama is dead. Now it is reasonable to assume that Ashwatthama denotes an elephant used in the war. But understanding him or misunderstanding him to be the sum of the Macharya led to a lie or absurdity. In line with the principle of charity, the listener should be what Quine is saying. Listener should be by default assume the form, the appropriate meaning. If there is a mismatch, it is not. So that is where exactly his whole idea of this evidence to assume otherwise lies. Now this is an epistemic assumption that people should not judge people to be irrational unless they have an empirically justified account of what they are doing when they violate normative standards. Now, other thinkers, Haggard and Nisbet, they also describe, drawing from this, a different degree of commitment to principle, this principle. Their version states that people should not judge people to be irrational unless they have an empirically justified account of what they are doing when they violate normative standards. Now, almost in similar line, Daniel Dennett in 1998 also have argued about the principle of humanity, where he says that others will have the propositional attitudes. The propositional attitudes, one supposes one would have oneself in their circumstances. What we are talking about empathy in certain sense, but this is about propositional attitudes. Now, what I am suggesting here is that these concerns are also normative, but what I am concerned about is the normative ground of charity, not exactly talking about placing oneself in those circumstances or sharing the kind of evidences. So, this normative ground of charity, and find these accounts focus and see that these accounts focus on the assumption of arriving at shared common empirical grounds and the possibility of a translation. Given the assumption that we all share the same rational capabilities, right? And what is rational capabilities? We already have a particular understanding, a universalized understanding of it. So I am proposing to reflect upon the normative ground for such propositional attitude or shared justificatory account along with the question of recognition. So I would say in a simpler word, I am taking a step back further to evaluate whether these kind of grounding would require further elaboration based on which they can be assessed. The crucial question for me is normities in which such conception of recognition can be extended charitably to epistemic claims by diverse individuals or groups. Even if such charity or leniency is desired for recognition, is it also tenable for alternative epistemic claims and epistemic identities. Also, we need to be careful in our assessment to see if this permission and recognition to be different, originating out of tolerant and non-judgmental desire, or is more an act of censure towards another culture or community and form. So the idea is you cannot outrightly throw away the baby along with the bathwater. So let me very briefly draw insights from Plato. Vala has already mentioned about this belief and knowledge distinction that Stephen talks about, which he talks about. I will not elaborate it upon, just a brief, just to recollect what he talks about. Is that understanding Plato in this modernist fascination for knowledge, supported by objectivity and justification, do not hold ground in all domains of life. This is what we brought up. So distinguishing knowledge from a mere belief, that is esteem from doxa, doesn't serve the very purpose of it. It makes that distinction, but that is not all what we may know, what is proposed. So Plato speculates on the nature of virtue in his dialogue, but makes a startling remark at the end of it, that true opinion is as good a guide to correct action as knowledge. Then right opinion is not less useful than knowledge. So when it comes to usefulness, there is no serious or no difference between knowledge and belief. Opinion, true opinion. As he says, why knowledge is more honorable? Because he makes the distinction. The honorability lies in, put it in a simpler word, stability of knowledge, what he otherwise calls recollection, fastening it by chain. This is his expression. Because knowledge is more stable, it stays that it can be retained now. So in social epistemic framework, if you resituate Plato, then Plato's recollection may be replaced with individuals' predispositions towards sociality. The bounded nature of knowledge remains the same, and so is its abiding character. Because Plato stresses upon this abiding character of knowledge. Not only it is possible to recollect. Now, Plato's claim is that the stability of knowledge makes it more valuable than true opinion. Further, when it comes to finding the right guide for men, Plato agrees that knowledge and true opinion are at par with each other, none inferior to other. He makes the whole dialogue more ingenious by proclaiming that knowledge is not looked for to be our guide in political life. He writes, statesmen must have guided states by right opinion, which according to him is in politics what divination is in religion. He concludes his dialogue by puzzling us further when he says, diviners and also prophets say many things truly, but they know not what they say. So it only qualifies for true opinion. Right? It's not like he's not saying they do not know, they say something which qualifies for true opinion. In fact, many of our most lasting beliefs do not have rational foundation, justification, or what he talks about time with the chain. Now, nevertheless, they do work as a guide in our everyday life. In other words, there is an epistemic adequacy in true opinions guiding our political and cultural lives. By saying so, Plato does not diminish the contrast between knowledge and belief. Instead, as I understand it, again, he compels us to think whether such contrast really needs to govern our conception of knowledge in all spheres of life. What kind of reality statesmen, poets, and prophets confront where knowledge loses its exclusivity and gives way to belief? The more pertinent question now is how to evaluate the truth and falsity of popular beliefs. Is such evaluation desirable or practicable? We can also ask, will a belief sound truer than others just because it is popular? Cluster of theories in the recent times grapple such evaluation. When the belief formation plays a crucial role in settling the question of recognition, these concerns cannot be overlooked. They need detailed analysis. Knowledge is not something static and invariable entity. It originates, grows, and is maintained in our activity, which are guided. In other words, to decipher the construction of the world is to construct knowledge. Now, Burgeon and Look suggest for inquiring what people know as reality in their everyday lives, which is norm or pre-theoretic. Focus must be on the idea of knowledge that constitutes the fabric of beings, without which no society could exist. Everyday life presents itself, they say, as a reality interpreted by man and subjectively meaningful to them as a coherent. Such reality is taken for granted as reality by each members of the society in conducting their individual lives meaningfully. It is a world that not only originates in their thoughts and actions, but is also maintained as real by these. Any attempt to understand the foundation and nature of knowing must take account of this everyday world which gets constructed in our intersubjective interaction. So knowledge gets continuously constructed and defined in the objectivation of the subjective experience, the first person into the second. In this intersubjective shared world, such process of objectivation of our subjective experience is made possible by the availability of a common language which is grounded in our everyday life. In some way, every act of mind in this intersubjective shared world reorients me from my subjective experiential domain to the temporal structure of everyday life. With even a simple act of walking, uttering, touching, and looking at someone or some object like my watch, I enter and re-enter the reality of everyday life. That is how one understands this very idea. Now, it is in this interaction my word gets constructed along with my knowledge of it. So, to enter in a society is to imbibe predisposition towards socialism. Such predispositions and participation on the part of the individual involves internalization of that which society makes objectively available to us. It is a prerequisite to share and find others' existence and intersubjectivity meaningful. It is a mutual identification of shared situations. Now, proposals of sociology of knowledge well articulated the significance of social context that gives rise to a system of knowledge in our everyday life or as a specialized technical branch like science. Now, its relevance is augmented in the present context where the issue of identity and recognition of culture is at the center stage. It extends the sociological inquiry from studying the condition of production of science to investigating and explaining the very content and nature of that knowledge. They argue for symmetry between modern science and any collectively held belief in terms of their status of being rationally justified. It would be a very legitimate inquiry in both the contexts to look for social causes or explaining why they hold the belief they hold. Their emphasis was not essentially identity of things that others would hold separate. Instead of clinging to the dualism of true and false, rational and irrational beliefs, these programs propose for symmetry in the style of explanation. The argument is the same type of causes would explain, say, true and false truth. For example, in a traditional therapeutic practice, it's a commonly cited example of medicine. In a society, may not be effective treatment of illness if compared with its alternatives in modern medicine. We have very commonly come across this. But it doesn't make the former irrational and false as long as the said practice upholds the metaphysical assumption of the society. Now, believers of such practice has no less rational reason than those who believe in the other. Interestingly, those who believe in modern medicine has no less social basis. Recognition of one over the other needs to be evaluated in their respective social context, not in terms of one being truer and rational a practice. Now, people in both knowledge systems are equally close to nature and equally embedded in society. Now, they can be charged here that it leads to a kind of relativistic catch, but there are a lot of responses which have already been given. Now, Goldman, I briefly use it, emphasizes that knowledge, especially the testimonial, depends upon background presuppositions of sincerity and competence. Now, hearers must assume, at least deficitly, that speakers are telling the truth and are epistemically competent. Now, these presumptions instantiate epistemic charity at the level of everyday epistemic practice. However, Goldman also acknowledges that credibility assessments are socially conditioned. Epistemic agents rely on socially available indicators of expertise and reliability, which may systematically disadvantage marginalized groups. Now, from the perspective of recognition, this reveals how failure of epistemic charity can become structurally entrenched, producing enduring forms of recognition. Now, all people, Western or non-Western, modern or pre-modern, interact with nature in attempting to explain it by bringing their culturally transformed, socially embedded conceptual schemes. Now, none in any case less rational in their explanation than others. The explanation of why they believe what they believe would require equal recognition and attention to both nature and society. In both cases, regardless of the truth and falsity of belief. So I reassert the claim that ascertaining epistemological egalitarianism of a kind, I mean the system is currently used, but a kind of egalitarianism would attain equal recognition of all societies. Folk beliefs are brought to the same level as scientifically attested. In both the cases, people and their practices, rituals get equal recognition in terms of having cognitive competent capacities, interests, and purposes in acquiring knowledge. Both can be compared against each other. So these literature which I briefly cited, they resolve that people in all societies comprehend nature through equally socially embedded and culturally approved categories. Same external nature takes infinitely different representations, and there is no way of telling which is a fact and which a fiction. Now let me conclude. It is urgent to recognize that knowledge, which aspires for universal appropriation and stability, can authorize our thought and action only in the social sphere, where it is more of a true opinion. Multifarious activities in our everyday life or in specialized sciences are interrelated and deemed to be so by a larger society and its reality. The very concept of knowledge, scientific or otherwise, involves an essentially communal element. So re-enchantment of knowledge is possible only by recognizing this fact and incorporating the creation of reality and the very creation of knowledge in people's everyday life. Now, native cultures and their epistemic claims can be understood only from the inside. Now, that is complete translation into one's own discourse is impossible. And that is why I said these other perspectives are more focused on this translation. As Charles Taylor says, if all cultures, I quote, if all cultures have made a contribution of worth, it cannot be that these are identical or even embody the same kind of worth. To expect this would be to vastly underestimate the differences. So we can at most recognize different kind of contributions arising from different cultures as competing with each other or complementing with each other. Resituating Plato's dialogue in Meno in the proposed context, we may say wittingly that objectivation of the image of Daedalus, he talks about it in that detailed dialogue, lies in liberating it from the bounds of individual human soul. In other words, the subjectivation of image of human soul is objectivized to make it its beauty and fruitfulness available to all. So it is in this attempt knowledge gets created in the intersubjective world. Its true recognition and stability lies in its ability to make the reality I live in a meaningful existence. If a true opinion is to qualify as knowledge, such objectivation is the only condition. Thank you.
Very good, Professor VIKRAM Singh. You have taken less than 2 weeks, less than your allotted time. 28 minutes instead of 30 minutes. And to be very frank, in my last 38 years of teaching, my reading was so limited that for the first time I'm hearing from him the epistemic charity, and he has beautifully brought out how in the intersubjective world and the relationship without proper grounding of the empirical evidence, how quick we are to judge others and to attribute even irrationality to others. And that has been, of course, clearly brought up, particularly in the assembly or in the parliament, the way the opponent or the opposition party and the ruling party, the fight with one another. And in a lesser degree, we even in the academic, very often in any seminar or conference, we do that. So I think it is a beautiful topic to reflect upon and to have a transformative life, as Professor Pala Ganapati has said, what can be really synthesized for our own well-being. Very beautiful one. Without much comment now, I open this paper for discussion, question, comment, or observation, if any.
I have an observation.
Yeah, please. Lopamudra.
I have an observation which supports what you have said. During tsunami, we did not know how to survive. We lost our lives, but the tribe in Andamans, they knew that tsunami is approaching, and the tribe, I do not remember the name of the tribe, they went to the hilltop with their cattle and they could survive. So this is, I would say, along with culture, it's nature. How you are trying with nature, how much you are, ingrained in nature. That also depends on what kind of folk thought you generate. It may not be scientific yet, but these do help us in supporting our lives. And moreover, it's not science and technology, I think that is smart. I will even consider cockroach to be smarter than human who survived for such a long. We know, I mean, how long a cockroach, the time since when cockroaches are with us. We are not there, but they are there. So the way to change themselves in according to the changing nature. Possibly we are the worst. We cannot change our bodies, but we can change our homes. I think this supports us.
Yeah, I think. What you're saying is like, I'll say the question which can come from here is that how we know the types better than let us say scientific prediction. Or if you extend it now to other species, you say cockroaches survive, have been surviving or much more than any other life forms we see now, right, including. So, what is our assessment of it? Now, here the question is only the survival that we see as an evidence. That they survived because they knew when to escape the danger. So, is there anything else which makes us within but their mode of prediction is what which we are talking about. Whichever way, let us say they predict it like by sensing the air. There are people who say that they can sense the rain. Now the point is like this is not a scientific method. So the point is not that the scientific method has no way to challenge. The point is like, or also not that it has to be translated into how they can sense the level of humidity and other wind direction, which other tools are not able to do in science. So the point is that they may have experience of the world and nature in which they have been living, not as an individual, but as a community. So that's what I am emphasizing more on community and culture. So that experience gets imbibed in the way of living. So there is a way in which that can be acknowledged. Charles Taylor is talking on those. But sometimes if we say that this illiterate farmer of a tribe who do not really know anything about that prediction is a superstition or something, that may be in some cases true, but that is where we are seeing the metaphysical system needs to be internalized in order to make this statement. So, but judging it or making an attempt to translate it into the scientific mode of understanding the rationality and other things. That is where the problem is. So, if you say, are they sharing the evidences? They cannot. Right? They are not really sharing the same evidences necessarily the way we identify that evidence.
Because we have developed scientific language
Right.
and they do not have that. So that is how.
So what I'm saying, if we say that they predicted, and again we are using the term, let us say, the wind direction, humidity, and they predict rain or a tsunami, right? So I'm saying we are again making an attempt to translate it in our own.
Right. Exactly.
So there where the translation work will have limitations. So in what way we judge them is the question. So I'm not really saying that it resolves it, but it is only saying that charity. That's why we are using this word, or epistemic charity. You cannot really make a claim that you are wrong or right. But saying that I consider you to be an equal epistemic agent as me, that is charity, right? So that status is where which I see is more fundamental than, let us say, a moral equality. Because unless I consider you to be a equal epistemic agent, right? Whatever the background, whether it fits into my way of evaluating knowledge I have. So that is where the place or even talking about some moral concerns. And that's why it is I said this is a kind of a more normative grounding which we can reflect upon before, let us say, talk about epistemic injustice. Because there are a lot of things which have been done.
One thing.
Abhijit has raised one.
So you have to leave. Abhishek will ask after me.
Okay.
Series of questions.
Okay,
So
go ahead,
this is
go
just a continuation of what Professor Lopamitra has asked. If we go through Livingston's structural anthropology, the service of mind, we already see that they have their particular way of knowledge, and which is scientific in nature. The primitive man, you may be thinking that they are primitive and they are just savages, but then the study of Livingstone anthropology has definitely shown that they are truly scientific in its own way. The language may be different, but they have a scientific and proper and be formulated, and there are lots of theory regarding the engineers and the bricklayer, how they are interdependent. So from that structural anthropological perspective, these tribes are not considered as uncivilized or primitive because they are also following a pattern that is truly scientific in nature. That is one understanding that because I do some structuralism. Another thing is when you were talking about the misrecognition and misidentification, my question is how will you bridge the understanding between individual misrecognition or misidentification with the collective misrecognition or misidentification of the same person who belong to the same community? Because you talk about both individual as well as community.
See, these biases, prejudices which we are talking about. If we say that it was very popular that if you want to hide something in Africa, the whites used to say that if you want to hide something from the blacks, then you put it in the book. Because the idea they want to. So now this is completely coming from a kind of a bias. Women cannot drive. Like we talk about various things. So it's a kind of a bias we carry. Now what are the bases in which that bias about the community group or collective is being talked about? So are they something which make my point, which I'm drawing from Charles is it not that women lose a sense of confidence, right, or a confidence on their rationality, black may lose when they imbibe even this, right? Why less drive people drive who are women, right, in many societies. So I'm saying is it because we believe for a long time certain things which we thought is kind of a reason, which we ourselves believe that we are doing in terms of our capabilities to do certain works. So the point which you are saying that this affects not only the community, but even the members, because the community bias is very important to address, which gets imbibed into even a member. So separating them is not really the point which I am making here. The point which I am making is that any bias for or against in the community is what the member act according to. So is this something which we need to address when it comes to treating communities, cultures, or groups as epistemic equals, right? So there is a kind of a charity in this sense that it is not like sympathy, and that's what I said. Charity doesn't stand for that kind of an idea. The point of charity is simply to consider other to be equal, even if their way of rationalizing things, acting, or mode of living is very different and doesn't translate into my mode of thinking, rationality, or practices. So the previous first question which you asked is this, that similar to person. But I mean, the point is that how these differences can be really seen as having value. So it is not necessary. This is a important concern I'm raising, that it is not necessary that it has to be translated that they are scientific. Savage, uncivilized, primitive, these are the things which we have been saying. It doesn't simply mean that not being modern make them uncivilized or less rational than others. The point is that translation alone cannot be the way to judge, because again you are using your own tools and methods to judge or to make a rational judgment of the extreme judgment about others. So that itself takes away the equality. So the point is that we are trying to see that there is a metaphysical aspects to it. There is an internalization which is required, and unless that is done, you cannot be in a position to assess it. Right? It is more of like it is possible to accuse them as to be falling into a relativistic trap, because then no one can make any assessment about it. That's a different question. Again, I'm saying the question which I am concerned about is that epistemic charity can be the first point from where this dialogue or somewhere can be. And then you talk about the equality of model time political.
Okay, Vijay.
Sir.
It's Abhishek. Thank you.
Sir, I have to leave. Okay. Ramitaji, I have to leave very soon. Sir. Thank you, everybody, for the beautiful hospitality and everything. Abhishek. No, okay, go. Sir. That was good. Where is it? Is it gone? Bye-bye.
Yeah, Abhishek. Not three actually, two questions which touch on the different aspects of when two different groups, indigenous or traditional local knowledge systems in the state or institutional knowledge systems, something like that. The first to concern what anthropologist Anu Agarwal has all drawing from his work, people have identified as the dichotomy of assimilation and division. Either we end up assuming that there is this unbridgeable gap or chasm between the local knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge, which you find in the writings of many anthropologists, or we approach the matter in a manner that makes one or the other what you're referring to as translation, but the attempt is to assimilate the good parts of a particular knowledge system in mainstream or institutionalized knowledge system. Philosophers of science have argued that this problem arises when we look at the problem from afar. So when we do not really get our hands dirty, when we don't adopt a naturalistic perspective. The other thing also, the thing that I learned from this conversation that we're having, we at times end up romanticizing communities. And this is again based on a reading of the local fisher folk in Kerala. Before a serious study was done, it was assumed that they have a knowledge of the wave and how they come and go, and they base their fishing activities on that. But it is only when sociologists and ethnographers they went there and studied what actually is happening. It seems they have a mechanism in which they rely on these stories, but they also rely on IMD reports. On IMD reports, the Institute of Meteorological Department, Indian Meteorological Department. So it is not the case that they are simply basing their understanding of this is a good time to go and fish based on these stories. They are also relying on modern scientific methods. So oftentimes what happens is that when we look at these things from afar, when we do not get our hands dirty, when we don't adopt a naturalistic perspective, we may end up romanticizing local knowledge systems. So it seems to me that these three issues which have been identified, or which these two issues that have been identified, of division and assimilation, and this further thing of romanticization, they could possibly be handled if we actually study in a more nationalistic spirit these systems, and then maybe the conclusions that we derive would be particular to these or this or that knowledge system rather than to all cases of such interactions. I know it's not really a question, but some of the things that I've been thinking about as I am also working on some of these questions.
See, the first point is very important because assimilation or division, this is where exactly we may fall into one of the trap. So, this is definitely a more complex issue when we talk about recognizing the differences. Now, this recognition would be fundamentally based on what? So, the basic philosophical debate is that moral equality is the concept. So, one claim which I am making here, drawing from this, I mean, even Charles Taylor talks about moral equality. So, we are saying that epistemic equality or equality. It's a very, I mean, I probably need to use a better word for this, but a kind of idea where I'm not saying it is equal, but it is, see, morally you can be equal, right? When we talk about just being human, one is a fool, mad, or a complete rational, sane person. You can basically morally be equal. But epistemic equality presupposes that there is an equal rational capabilities, irrationalities in a way, certain common grounds in which we talk. So obviously there is not each, to be misunderstood as one and same. The point which we are making is that this charity has to be there. That's the ownership. I mean, who has the ownership or who is more responsible? The one who is an inquirer, who's saying that tribal knowledge or who makes this judgment. See, if a tribe or a fisherman or a farmer is not talking about questioning scientific knowledge, then this question doesn't even really arise. But if we in the modernity have that drawback which many postmodernists raise, or post-colonial literature talks about, feminist literature talks about. The idea is that when this question is raised about dismissing things, there where the question of charity comes. So I am raising that point that epistemic charity at that level would probably neither fall on assimilation or in division, but more of identifying the differences, right? And this difference, because equality in terms of moral would also talk about certain similarity, just being human. We are why human and cockroaches are not same. So we are talking about human species to be treated, right? So that is where we are saying that there is a possibility of epistemic charity too, which can probably add more discourse on that may help us to create a ground which will give a little more position than talking about the common translating grounds. Right? That is the first point which I am. So I'm not saying I'm really addressing the question much, but it's just an assessment. Yeah, you're right. Romanticizing community is there, right? As I said, like talking about tsunami being predicted, fishermen using certain tools or not. So obviously this reliance is there. So the answer to the first question was they are not questioning, they are more welcoming and open, they have respect for that. So this question doesn't arise for them. We may romanticize, knowing or without knowing it. The point is when we say that no, they are using methods which are should not be, they should update themselves. Now, this is where we need to be a little more cautious. That is the point which I am. So, but let us say 15 days before a farmer, there are many. Here I have come across people cited. They say that now it will rain after such a 15, 20 days before if somebody can predict. That looks like something which you cannot really say. It is only that how they sense it. So there are ways in which certain methods can be simply accepted without making an attempt to translate it. Certain mode of thinking which we are used, right? And mostly, I think the modern science and modernity in general has made that sway towards. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much. All the papers are in a way slightly unconventional, and they are intellectually and morally highly engaging. And the credit also goes to Namita for classifying them together beautifully. So we all enjoyed, so we give a round of applause to all of them.
Thank you so much, sir, for your nice sharing the session. Now may I request our Lupamita Sodri ma'am, she will be delivering the certificates to the two speaker. আপনাকে অনুরোধ জানাচ্ছি, অল্প কষ্ট দিচ্ছি আপনাকে। Now, our distinguished resource person of this session, Dr. VIKRAM Singh sir will get a certificate as a recognition from our Lupamita ma'am. ম্যামকে আমি আহ্বান জানাচ্ছি আপনি সামনে এসেন বিক্রম স্যারের সার্টিফিকেট দিয়ে দিবেন। Padri sir already has left, but now I request Abhishek sir